Hi, everybody. My name's Rick Pector. Hopefully most of you know me. I'm a principal solutions architect in my actually 20th year at MicroStrategy, I'm proud to say. I was actually scheduled to deliver this presentation last February, so it's taken a few months to get through the queue of the knowledge exchanges. This is actually some work I did with Green Dot. We had a nice West Region deal for them at the end of last year, $1.2 million deal. So let me jump into my presentation here. I'm going to just do a little bit of setup on what Green Dot is. In case of you haven't heard of them, they're the world's largest prepaid debit card company. And so an interesting fun fact, a significant portion of Americans actually don't have a checking account that they can receive money into like from their employer or to write checks out of each month. And so these prepaid debit cards become a convenient alternative to cash, especially because they can be reloaded. And most of the time, these are kind of on a gift card mode. Green Dot is the world's leader in providing these prepaid Master and Visa cards here in the U.S. They're also the payment technology platform for Apple Pay Cash, for Uber, for Intuit. They're based here in Southern California, where I'm at in Pasadena. In the third quarter of last year, well, they're a long-term customer. We kind of re-injected and reinvigorated the account at the end of last year, working with Rick Frosto. Rick Frosto is the sales engineer, and Lucia Kubian is the sales executive. And so at the end of last year, we did a POC, and about 1/3 of it from their request was to have some predictive component. Quite frankly, they didn't have a lot of requirements on the predictive side, so I'm going to show you what I kind of came up with. And it's not a bad, for most customers that are new or just getting into predictive analytics, this isn't, forecasting is usually the first rung of the ladder. And what I'm going to show you is a little bit of a forecasting app. Let's try to keep this interactive. If you have questions, please go off mute and let me know if you have any questions. So with that, back at the POC that we did last September, I pulled together a little bit of a forecasting dossier, something that I used native MicroStrategy capabilities for. And what you're going to see is something, if you've seen some of my stuff, of forecasting stuff before that might be familiar. I've got a heat map selector on one side here. I've got some statistics that show me the quality of the model, its R-squared value, how much of the variability in the thing we're trying to predict is explained by the model. And then we're actually going to look at this region here on the right. That is we're going to actually train a model on data from some time period. We're going to then monitor and validate those results. So imagine, if you will, that I trained a model on data through June 2018. I could then, in going into July and forward, I could actually take this model and compare the green actual results with the predicted results from my forecast. And the difference between the forecast and the actual is something we call the residual, what's left over, or also the error. And I can do some math to sum up these errors and boil it down to a single number. That mean absolute percent error is a good measure of data. It's something humans can relate to. And you're going to see MAPE, or mean absolute percent error, in my presentation here. It just simply measures how much accuracy my model is. And that's measured as a percentage, so people can relate to it. And so this is actually not the application that I want to talk about with the alerting, but this is the same technology. I'm actually using MicroStrategy Native to build some predictive models. Let me just a little bit of this actually from the presentation we gave to the customer, where we talked about how we came up with some variables to use MicroStrategy to do regression. In this case, we're trying to forecast transaction volume in dollars, as well as the number of transactions. And so here you can see, the amount of sales and the number of transactions behind those sales. And then so these are the things I'm going to try and predict, actually two different dependent variables, the dollar amount and the quantity of transactions. And I'm going to use to predict that a couple variables, a day index that just simply goes up one value per day. And so this is going to carry the general trend of my data. I think you'll see that more in a second. There's also a strong seasonal pattern here, and that's important because of Green Dot's retail focus. Transactions tend to be lower on the weekend and higher midweek. Now, if you're a movie theater, when people go to the theater on the weekends more than midweek, then maybe that might be different. But on the whole, on the average, and we're looking at the average of many thousands of transactions each day, they tend to be higher during the week and lower during the weekend. Notice that there are some spikes, and we'll talk about those in a second, but for the most part, there's a pretty regular weekly pattern. And so we're going to use this day index to capture the general trend, and we're going to use the day of week to capture the seasonality. And the day of week is just, I'm giving you the metric expressions that I use to do these. I'll be making the presentation available afterwards, so hopefully this will serve as a good resource for another POC if you wanted to jump to that. So step one is always a data set report where I have nothing predictive on it, but I've got my target variables and the things that I want to predict. Once I have that, I can actually add some training metrics. And this was built I'm using MicroStrategy Developer to build a training report. I filtered my data on the dates up until the end of June 2018. And I went through and built my linear regression model for my sales amount and came up with my sales predictor. I did the same thing with the linear regression models for my sales quantity and built a predictor for that. And when I add these training metrics to my report and run it, I get told that, hey, predictive metrics were created in the place I told it to be created. And therefore, we can use these things to monitor forecasts for the future. One other twist that we used for this is that we actually did a unique forecast for each combination of a Green Dot product, and these are the lists of some of their more key gift debit card products. And there's a number of retailers that actually sell those products. And so we decided to do over 300 non-overlapping product family times retailer segments. And this resulted in over 300 predictive models that MicroStrategy created, all in one predictive metric. And we had one predictive metric that had the 312 forecast for sales amount, as well as the quantity or the number of sales transactions. And so that was pretty cool. And then we can kind of view the predictive models here. That's a little bit what I've got shown on this screen, and you could do that with Developer. And so, this was, again, the POC that we did at the end of September. The reason why I'm dragging you through this is I could actually show them the accuracy of these models for each of the various segments. In fact, if I can go here, and as long as my machine is still cooperating, I can actually show you the live version of this dossier. And this is, again, from the POC where we're just doing forecasting right now. But, for example, for Walmart, the model that was built for Walmart wasn't that great from an R-squared value. And we could see the mean absolute percent error of the Green Dot Classic card that's sold at the retailer Walmart is in the 20% range. This is not a great model. You don't like to see errors this high. Some other errors, might be a little bit different or better. I think Dollar Tree was slightly better from a forecasting point of view. CVS here even better still. Now these are in the usually for predictions plus or minus 10% is a reasonable threshold that most people would like to see accuracy to within 10%. When you get to 10 to 20%, you begin to drift off into areas that people aren't very happy with that. Okay, so that was the POC dossier, and we used it for forecasting. And so we kind of had the selector motif. We've got some things, and here's all the variables that we did with MicroStrategy. Let me fast forward to earlier this year when we started a services engagement that started as part of the completed sale at the end of 2018. In this, we did a requirement that came out of a little bit of a discovery session with one of the teams responsible for understanding and monitoring transaction volumes, especially like in their call center and understanding what's going on. Green Dot's world was a concept of a negative balance transaction. That's when instead of money flowing out to a retailer from somebody purchasing something, instead it's cash going back to an individual. And negative balances means that money's flowing in a different direction and could be indication of fraud. And so we went and did a bunch of things in the POC. We exceeded some goals, including doing some predictive training. And so, a good relationship established with our data science team. And one reason why I'm kind of just tooting my own horn here is when we succeed, when we have good interaction with the customer, when they're kind of open to MicroStrategy. In fact, I note here that there was this Yushin guy who didn't know MicroStrategy at all, but really enjoyed analytics and is responsible for doing data science there. Being able to work side by side with this individual is a big step in gaining adoption within the account. And so let me show you the alerting dossier that we're going to do, and it's kind of a similar concept. We're going to go ahead and train some models on data through a certain time period, and then we're going to monitor that data going forward in the future. And we're going to, instead of using this forecast as a prediction, let's say for financial purposes, we're going to use it to set expectations. And we're going to be able to detect when transaction volumes exceed expectations. One thing I want you to note here is that the transaction volumes, you can see the nice weekly pattern, and there's actually 6 different statistics that they track. There's total and net negative balance transactions for purchases and credit reversals. Those are 2 different types of transactions. And so basically we've got 6 different predictive models that we built here. The first thing we did was we set a filter to control the data used to build the models. And let's assume that every month Green Dot is refreshing their models. And so at the end of December 2018, we could build a model built based on this data. And then after we've built our model through this time period, we'll then go ahead and validate that model or use that model to then monitor actually into the future. When we go to the monitoring phase, now I've trained my model on one data. I can now change my time dimension on my chart to focus down on the time period that I'm interested in. Here's to the end of 2018 that we set our training data end on. And so anything beyond that from the model's point of view is considered, quote, the future. And the expected line here is this green area. Anything in the green area at this line or below meets the expectations of our predictive model or below. Therefore, anything above it, like anything in this yellow region, is higher than expected. And in fact, we have confidence bands, the ability to say how confident I'm in prediction and set an upper confidence band. And anything that exceeds my upper confidence band is way more than expected. And so we can kind of have two levels of an alert here. And the blue circles that you'll see are maybe, hey, things are above than expected, a little bit of warning. Maybe that's just an email that goes out in the morning. But the red ones are things that are, hey, things are quite higher than expected. Let's set an alert. Let's do something, maybe send a pager or a text or something out because there's something going on here that demands that's much higher than expected. And that's the total gist of this. Now, I have a YouTube video for this, but rather than go through that's there for reference, let me go and show you the actual negative balance dossier in action. This was actually using a dossier that the cool thing about this was I was able to leverage some of the data that was already built in a dossier. I created a little landing page which includes my YouTube video and a little bit of the explanation that I just walked you through. From a MicroStrategy point of view, this page in my dossier is used to train models. And here I can set my filter to say what data I'm going to use for training my models. And so this is my quote training report. And I'm actually going to train 6 different predictive models, one for each type of negative balance transaction. And while it says loading data here, I'm actually creating or building these 6 different predictive models. So there's a little bit of a heavy lifting going on. Quite honestly, while I showed you before the work I did with native MicroStrategy, this demo actually uses R to do ARIMA forecasting. And so we're actually letting R go through a solution space with ARIMA to find the best time series forecast. So instead of regression, we're using R and its time series forecasting. Remember I mentioned that there was in fact, this actually really did happen earlier this year. And in fact, when we spoke to them in February, they were still stinging by something that happened in January, where they had a run of negative balance transactions that was much higher than expected, but they didn't have this alerting app there. And so if you'll notice what's happening now, imagine if we did set our training model for the end of 2018, and now I'm in January and I'm monitoring this, they would have noticed that that on the 14th of January, boom, we hit our first kind of severe, extremely high negative balance transaction, higher than expected. We can also see in the days that followed, it continued to be high. The problem for Green Dot is they didn't notice this until too much later to deal with what turned out to be some sort of fraudulent or nefarious activity. And so this dossier would have helped them alert quite early in the process, as well as gave them some warnings. You can kind of see the other pages here, as well as I can look at different measures or different transactions. And so, it's pretty simple. These thresholds can be turned into MicroStrategy alerts. It was very easy for the customer to convey this stuff. And all I'm doing is basically taking the predictive metric, which is this green line, giving me the expected value, and one of the confidence bands that we can return from it, and using those to just be thresholds that I set and let those thresholds drive the alerts. And the following month, when I go and I want to redo this, I can just take my dossier and increase my dates to the end of, I got close to the end of January, not exactly as far as I could, but it'll be fair enough. I've gotten beyond the dates we were having those problems. And so once a month, I'll retrain these models, and I will then be able to get a new set of alerting for the following month that's been updated on the latest, greatest data. And that's what we're showing here. And what you'll see once this completes is that we'll be able to get past that blip of scores in January and begin to look into February and see how results were turning out. Any questions or comments on this so far? Right now this is, I think, a function of the dossier. What I discovered after going through this with Green Dot, also Rich Rogers, program management from technology, was sitting in on the Green Dot meetings. What I got feedback from technology is because I'm using the graph control here in the dossier, it's actually kicking off multiple training executions. If I had used a grid control instead of the graph control, then the engine wouldn't be submitting so many recalculations. In newer versions of this demo, you'll see that I'm using a text grid, but I'm actually literally showing you what I did with Green Dot. The other thing is this is only supposed to happen once a month. And so you're incurring this, training is a little bit of heavy lifting. We are going through a little bit of a champion challenger workflow because the ARIMA algorithm in R does go through a solution space of different, trying to search for the best ARIMA model. And so it is numerically intensive. We do expect that. But this is taking a little bit longer. I don't know if it's my machine not cooperating today or what it is. Great question. Good question there. Yeah, this is an updated one. And the message to my sales engineers here is that while we have the off-the-shelf R script for ARIMA, I'm setting up the data science workflow. If I can just take a few minutes here, all data science actions, anytime you're going to do something that involves model building, you need to get data. You need to turn that data into a data set. We need to run algorithms that will train our models. That's what's kind of running right now. Once we have those models, we can then generate scores, and then we can deploy those out to users. And ideally, this is where MicroStrategy is really needed. Otherwise, if you weren't deploying to users, why do you need MicroStrategy in the loop? And so the ARIMA script that we have goes through this flow, and it was a very simple off-the-shelf R script that we had for ARIMA forecasting. It takes in data. If the target values are not NA or missing or mole, if I have values that I'm trying to forecast on, then we'll use those records for training. But if they're not any values beyond the last known data point, we're going to assume is the future, and we're going to forecast that the future wouldn't have any values. And so as a simple way for this one off-the-shelf analytic, we wanted to keep the off-the-shelf ones pretty simple. And this is kind of what I'll call a one-shot forecasting model. It uses the same data it's being trained with to score. The problem with this is I couldn't then apply my model to, let's say, February when I have actual results, because it will think it's going to train on those dates rather than monitoring for them. And so I came up with an ARIMA with train mode R script. This is the first version I did with Green Dot. I've come up with some subsequent versions as well that allows me to break by segment, because actually this version with Green Dot, while I showed it segmented during the POC, the actually alerting, we didn't implement segmentation. So I have a segmented ARIMA script that does some more capability. And in fact, the most recent version I'm calling a segmented forecast script because it does some things like outlier handling in the middle of the series and does some more robust forecasts, including giving you the option to push to Mysterio or push to a table for batch scoring as well as on-the-fly scoring that I'm showing you here. There's not a lot of time in this call to go into a lot more details. Suffice it to say that when you're interested in this, please get me on the phone. I'm going to have some video resources for you, but I'd like to coach you through your first engagement. And so as you have customers that might need this, you can say, hey, Rick, it's great that you showed that in the knowledge exchange. I didn't really catch all of it, but I think I want to do it. Can you help me work with my customer? Yes, that's what I do. That's what my job is. So I'm looking forward to doing that with you when you have the time. And I do have this new segmented script that's not going to be on the R script shelf. It's going to be something that we use internally. It's a little bit more complex. I have to give thanks to Jared Julius, who worked with Quick Trip for building out the requirements for this segmented forecast script, and I'm really pleased with it. I think it's going to give us some very good capabilities that an SE can pick up. The great stuff about this forecasting things is it just really takes three inputs. I need a measure of the thing I'm trying to forecast. I need the measure of time, and maybe something that tells me how to segment the data. And with just those three columns, I can go and build some predictive models that does segmented forecasting in a real powerful way. And then show you how to actually compute the statistics so you can see how good the model is. Let's go back to our dossier real quick. Okay, it did finish. And if I look at my scoring now, if I just give this one little kick to update it, what we'll see is that what was the future the last time around. Now that I'm updating my scores, and if I had launched this for the first time, it would have updated. Now January's in the past. Right, I used my January to build my models, and now I can see what I would have alerted on going ahead in the future. Looks like I had one little slightly above red alert here that might be a false alarm. That is a possibility with this type of application when you have false alerts, and that requires maybe some tuning of of these thresholds. But as you can see, now that I've got past the blurb of activity in January, I've got a little bit more of a regular pattern, and I can see that, I've got a few blue ones. Those would be the low priority ones, and just a couple reds here. And I could even break it down further by looking at purchases. And I can do that. It'll actually, right now, it's on the fly rescoring using the updated model that was done during training. So now I can see my latest scores, and this was received really well at Green Dot. It was kind of an eye-opener, and even though during the POC that they didn't have their requirements, this was something that came out of that POC in a great discovering session done by Lucy to kind of kick those things off. I'm definitely out of time here, so I want to leave time for the sales enablement demo. I will make the presentation available. I've got some more details. If some of this went over your head, like you don't know what predictive analytics are, I've got some slideware that talks a little bit about linear regression and how that works, as well as how this time series stuff works and what an R-squared value is. I even included a little Moneyball stuff that shows how we can use our squared values to show why batting average is a useless predictor in baseball. It's another great application of R-squared. I've got some 1-minute videos that kind of show trend analysis. Is actually using a healthcare example, but it's here in the PowerPoint as well that I'll be making available as part of this, including a little bit of how the time series stuff works as well. So if you're new to this, forecasting is the first rung in the predictive analytics ladder. It's a great way to get exposed to MicroStrategy's capabilities and actually play with some things that can be really intuitive. So with that, I'll wrap up my presentation. Any questions or comments on that or feedback? That's a great question. Yeah, let me think about that. Showing what the value of this is really here. Well, imagine if they had detected what was going on with this fraudulent activity, they might have been able to avoid, and I don't know what the area under this curve, but you can see how many, this is actually looking at the volume of transactions, not the dollar amount. I think it's great what your question is. You should be able to compute what could have been saved if they could have avoided, if they could have just brought back those levels back to something normal, they would have saved that entire area under curve there. Yep. Great question. Okay. Well, if that's it, thanks everybody. If you have any questions on this, if this went too fast, or if you have a customer where you really have an application, get me on the phone. Be glad to walk you through it. Now you've been exposed to it, so hopefully it'll be another interesting approach to forecasting where we're not so much depending on the accuracy of that model as we are on using a model to set expectations and then detect when things are different than expected. And that type of anomaly detection is really powerful in lots of different organizations. So it's a cool application of forecasting, but it's not really looking at the quality of the forecast as much as it is using it to monitor and set expectations. Cool. Thanks, everybody.